On this episode of China Unscripted, China is slowly taking over Antarctica. They're building mysterious facilities that could be militarized, and no one is doing anything to stop them. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Gnesta.
And joining us today is Alex Gray. He's a senior fellow in national security affairs at the American Foreign Policy Council, and he served on the U.S. National Security Council staff from 2018 to 2021, including as director for Oceania and Indo-Pacific Security. Alex, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. So, today we're going to be talking about Antarctica, Chinese territory since ancient times.
Yeah, that's what they'd like you to think.
I'm sure the whole world has been.
I'm sure there's a Qing Dynasty manuscript that shows that they had herding rights in Antarctica or something.
The Chinese buffalo of Antarctica.
Yeah, there you go.
Well-known story. Well, so this is interesting because I think a lot of people just think of Antarctica as like a giant ice cube that has no value whatsoever. Why is Antarctica important?
Well, it's important for a number of reasons. There's typical to most of these things, there's the possibility that there may be energy resources, there may be rare earth elements. There's certainly in the Southern Ocean, we know that there's fishing stocks. There's also potential military importance. It sits at the South Pole, which has the ability from a military standpoint to impact satellite communications and telescopic arrays. And there are a number of different military applications that could benefit a country that had a presence near the South Pole or that had the ability to kind of have unimpeded access to Antarctica. So there's a lot there. It's not just frozen, terra nullius. There's a lot that control or dominance in Antarctica gets you as a superpower.
Well, you mentioned the military application of Antarctica. According to the Antarctica Treaty, countries aren't allowed to establish military bases or conduct military activity in Antarctica.
Well, that's what the treaty says. That's what most countries abide by. And if they don't abide by it, for instance, in certain cases, you're allowed to use military personnel and transport aircraft to go and facilitate your scientific endeavors. So, for instance, the United States uses Air Force C-130s to take the National Science Foundation to its McMurdo station and to different scientific sites in Antarctica. And that's fine. And what we do is we send a notification to the Antarctic Treaty System per the requirements of the treaty saying, hey, at this date, at this time, a C-130 with markings so-and-so is going to show up on the continent, and it's going to have Master Sergeant so-and-so and Captain so-and-so, and it's all very above board and it's very legalistic. What the Chinese have done is they've started showing up with PLA personnel at their research stations, and they don't tell us, they don't tell the treaty system that they're using PLA officers in what are supposed to be scientific capacities. We only found this out when some netizens were able to sleuth this out and make it public. So the Chinese have been in violation of the non-militarization parts of the treaty. And that's just the surface. There's a lot we don't know. There are a lot of unknown unknowns. And that's what I think has a lot of us concerned.
When was the last time the U.S. inspected any of the Chinese research facilities there? Because
inspections are part of the Antarctica Treaty, correct?
Inspections are the only mechanism to actually ensure that the treaty's being complied with. And so in 2011, the United States did an inspection. Australia has done one a little bit more recently, I think 2015. New Zealand hasn't done an inspection in 15 years, and they're really the most capable of the Antarctic powers that are aligned with us. And yet they really have not done any inspections in a decade and a half. What really concerns me is the Chinese most recently built a station called Kunlun. And Kunlun is down near the magnetic South Pole. And it's on the highest ice feature on the continent, which from a military standpoint, that's going to give you a lot of potential advantages if you're interested in satellites and arrays and different things. What I'm particularly concerned about is the fact that the United States, Australia, New Zealand, no one other than Chinese nationals has ever visited the Kunlun station. We have no idea what goes on there. It's never been held to any scrutiny. And the choice of location is so strategic that it raises a lot of questions. The only way of which we're going to get answers to is by actually having boots on the ground and doing inspections.
I think what's crazy is 2011 is the last time the U.S. inspected any station. And in 2011, China had not built any artificial islands in the South China Sea, right? That's how long ago it was, right? And then, So we know that China has the ability to build and militarize in just a period of a few years. So we really need to be inspecting these every year, right? Or can't we at least get some kind of presence there? Is it not impossible to fly U.S. personnel to visit?
So the logistics are really why. It's a combination, in my opinion, of logistics and political will. So, anything in Antarctica is hard. It's just difficult. It's far away. It's cold. It's normal logistical considerations are amplified tenfold in everything you do on the continent. And so when we're thinking about how the United States is going to do what you're describing, we just haven't made the investments for a long period of time in the type of things that we used to do to be an Antarctic power. So icebreakers, right? We don't have the icebreaker capability that we used to have, which is critical for us to be able to hit some of the Chinese Great Wall Station, which is closer to South America. That's where an icebreaker would come in handy. We don't have that capability right now. We used to have specially fitted C-130s in large numbers that could land on Antarctic airfields, even in the winter months, the Antarctic winter. Those have really been neglected, and they're in short supply. So we haven't made those decisions. We also, frankly, as someone who served in government and was focused on this, it was not a high priority for most of the time I was there, and particularly at the level of senior officials who are thinking about competition with China. The Arctic was beginning to get some traction. Secretary Pompeo talked about it a lot, paid attention to it. We obviously had a lot of focus on the East and South China Seas. We had even increasing focus on what China was doing in the Atlantic and their desire to increase their presence on the west coast of Africa. But Antarctica just did not seem to penetrate as an area where it was worth pressing investments and raising the focus on Chinese ambitions to the fore. And I think that's got to change at the highest levels before we're going to see the money put forward to take these kind of logistical investments. Because it's expensive stuff. Everything in Antarctica is it's hard to do and it's costly. And we've got to have that political will to make those investments.
How big physically, geographically, is Antarctica compared to the continental United States?
I don't have a good comparison, but I'll tell you just the effort of getting from Christchurch, New Zealand, where the Antarctica New Zealand has a very robust base in the South Island of New Zealand, where we do a lot of our National Science Foundation staging. Just the effort to get from there to the New Zealand bases, which are not, really just a couple of hours flight. The logistical preparation involved in doing that is, millions of dollars, is incredibly manpower intensive. So if you think about just really a relatively short hop across from New Zealand to Antarctica, you think about doing that to do inspections of multiple bases across the width of the continent. You've got, most likely, I think, diplomatically, the best way to do this. It can't be the U.S. going and inspecting Chinese bases alone. It's got to be the U.S. with partners and allies inspecting multiple countries' bases. This isn't about targeting China. This isn't about making China the victim. This is about, we have a treaty system. The treaty system requires inspections to make it a viable long-term entity. And so everyone should be subject to the same inspection regime. And that includes the United States. And we've been inspected before. We should be inspected again. And it should be part of our kind of international effort to uphold norms and values. If we subscribe to a treaty, we should be anxious to see every aspect of it upheld.
Is China inspecting our bases?
When I was in government, there was discussion that it might happen. I never saw it happen. I would not be surprised if eventually a decision was made that they were going to begin a more vigorous inspection regime themselves. Partially, I think, because it would support their claim to be the predominant power in Antarctica. But so far, where I've seen the most activity, the Russians continue to be very active in Antarctica. Some of the Scandinavian countries like Norway are very, very vigorous in upholding the inspection regime. Argentina is another one that pays a lot of attention to it. But we'll have to watch and see what the Chinese do ultimately in that area.
How many bases does China have in Antarctica?
So they have 5, and they also have a runway, which when they constructed the Antarctic, most recently they constructed the runway. That is what I think should have been a tip-off to people that there was going to be a increased focus by Beijing on long-term presence in Antarctica, that they were going to be thinking about expanding their presence to more potentially security-focused posture. And also, one of the things that, if you're concerned as I am about China's adherence to the Madrid Protocol, which is the environmental aspect of the treaty system, in which says you can't extract resources, you can't mine, you can't do the type of fishing the Chinese are known for. Having a runway signals that there may be some potential interest in increased commercial activity on the continent, which is something we need to be watching very closely.
So this runway, like I thought, when we send our Air Force planes to land at McMurdo Base, how do they land if there's no runway? They just land on the ice or what?
Yeah, so they actually have special skis that'll let you land. That'll let you land in kind of non-paved, icy conditions. Obviously, the maintenance on those things is pretty expensive and pretty intense. Also, I think one of the things the Chinese have come to the realization of, and this is, you mentioned the South China Sea, every bit of infrastructure that can be implanted in a place like Antarctica adds to the sense of permanence and adds to the sense that China is a power with legitimacy. And if you look at Kunlun, you look at Great Wall Station, you look at the airfield, these are massive construction projects in a place where massive construction projects are hard to do and are not normal. And it's a signal by their very nature, the amount of infrastructure that has to be brought to Antarctica to complete them. It's a signal of just how ambitious this approach to the southern continent is. And it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen because the Chinese just woke up one day and decided we're really interested in doing Antarctic research. If you look at their global ambitions and their behavior across the world, you've got to see it in the context of this is part of how the Chinese operate when they're expanding their presence into a place they view as strategically vital. And it all fits into that context.
Have other countries built runways in Antarctica? Is China doing something that's out of the norm?
So it's not out of the norm. The New Zealanders have done it. I'm sure other countries have done it as well. I think you've got to look at it in the context of the commentary that comes from Xi Jinping and from the senior leadership of the party, which is talking about Antarctica as a part of their strategy, their national strategy, which is talking about dominance in Antarctica and using terminology that talks directly to that speaks of the strategic aspects of the continent. You have to look at it, like I mentioned, with PLA officers who are coming in and are not being reported. the massive amount of infrastructure that's being put into the airfields and the stations, where they're choosing to build the stations. Like I mentioned, the highest ice feature on the continent. And then you have to look at it in the context of the Madrid Protocol. And, well, I'm sure we'll talk about it more, but the bottom line is the Madrid Protocol is a additive document that prescribes what economic activity can be done on the continent. The answer is basically none. Nothing, very little commercial activity, and certainly nothing extractive, mining for rare earths, mass fishing. What the Chinese have started doing is very, very much a disinformation campaign. Chinese scholars have begun writing that the the Madrid Protocol to the treaty expires in 2049. It does not. It just doesn't expire. That's propaganda. No scholar anywhere else in the world believes that the Madrid Protocol expires in 2049, but they repeat it over and over and over again with, in my opinion, with the goal of laying the foundation for a kind of similar to the 9-dash line or similar to other kind of United Front type activities that we've seen, laying a predicate for just ignoring the treaty, beginning to do extraction at some point, beginning to do mining, beginning to do commercial fishing, and then saying to the world, well, it expired, sorry, and going about their business. And I think when you take all of this in context, we get into a place where I have a lot of concerns about what the next decade or 2 decades is going to look like from China and Antarctica.
This just sounds like the pattern the Chinese Communist Party has done everywhere in the world. Why? It's like the writing is on the wall. Why isn't, the Western world really concerned about this?
I think it's a lot of Antarctica's far, it's cold, it's not, we don't have a permanent population. The treaty, I think, is one of those things typical in Washington, and I would go so far to say as Canberra and Wellington, where it's seen as it's been there since the late 50s. It works for the most part. We made it through the Cold War without some sort of major, conventional military clash in Antarctica. It's seen as just kind of a basic good government treaty that doesn't have a lot of focus. When I was in the government, and I would try and work with the folks who do this issue in the State Department. It's the folks in the bureau that handle science who are focused on Antarctica. You're not going to find people who are the strategists and people who are focused on the China threat. That's not who's focused on Antarctica. And so we've had this mentality for 60 years that Antarctica is a place for scientific inquiry, and it's peaceful because that's what the treaty says. And unfortunately, like so much else, like fishing globally, like space, like cyberspace, like the deep sea, China doesn't view these global commons the same way we do. And I think what we've got to do is raise awareness in Washington that this is no longer simply something that can be handled by the people at the National Science Foundation and the folks in the Economic Bureau at the State Department or the Cultural Bureau. This has to be something that's thought of and handled by the Pentagon, by the China hands at the State Department and the National Security Council, by the Coast Guard, by the Navy. This needs to be treated the same way we treat other areas of significant great power competition.
It sounds like what you're saying is that in addition to the Space Force, the U.S. also needs the Ice Force.
Yeah, that'll be the next service. But in the meantime, what we need is the U.S. Coast Guard fitted with icebreakers. We need to go back to a force posture where the Coast Guard is operating icebreakers. This isn't just Antarctica. This is the Arctic too. The Russians have 40 or 50 icebreakers, quite a few of which are nuclear powered. The Chinese are building icebreakers. The United States needs to be investing in something. If we want to continue to be a polar power, both north and south, we have to have the tools to be one. And if we don't have icebreakers, if we don't have the well-maintained C-130 lift capability to get to the poles, we're going to abrogate that responsibility. And so you've got to make these investments now, or we're going to wake up one day and we're going to be dependent on the Chinese to let us into Antarctica. I really believe it's that much of a sleeping threat that it's just another example of Washington kind of taking its eye off the ball and the Chinese moving into a space where there's not sufficient attention at a high level.
So you're saying if we don't stop this now, China will at some point eventually completely take over Antarctica and restrict access to everyone else?
So you all know nothing with the Chinese is, at least so far, whether you look at South China Sea or East China Sea, nothing has been that immediate, and there's always nuance to it. But what happens is the eye comes off the ball in the West. We assume that the Chinese operate by the same sets of norms and international standards that we do, and the cycle repeats itself over and over again. They then make calculations based on their interests. They operate on an entirely different set of factors than Washington does. You fast forward 5 years, 10 years, the Chinese begin making investments. They begin building up their capabilities. They begin pressuring other powers who have similar interests, using economic coercion, using united front activity, using diplomatic coercion. And they gain increasing preponderance in whatever the theater is. And we see it in the South China Sea, and we see it in the Arctic. And next thing you know, it becomes more and more difficult for the United States to operate in whatever the theater in question is. And so I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that over time, if we don't increase our capabilities, if we don't get our allies to focus on this the way that they should be and the way we should be, and the Chinese continue on the path that they're on, I don't see it as out of the realm of possibility that you could have some form of anti-access, whether it's kinetic, whether it's simply by, whether it's de facto, whether it's any number of things. I don't see it as out of the realm of possibility that there is a Chinese anti-access effort in Antarctica. And that could take a number of forms, but I don't think that's out of the question.
Because you mentioned the South China Sea, and one of the things they're doing there is really trying to kind of bully politically and on the ground the other countries that have claims in the areas. How are they dealing with other countries in Antarctica? Are they kind of coming in and being like, we're gonna be here, or are they trying to cooperate scientifically? What are they doing?
So one of the interesting things about scientific cooperation, and I've got to give a shout out here to Professor Anne-Marie Brady from New Zealand, who's done brilliant work on this. Her research shows that for all the talk about, the Chinese are here just for peaceful cooperation, just for scientific inquiry, when she looked at the amount of peer-reviewed research coming out of Chinese scientists in Antarctica, it was minimal. It was, for all the major powers, they were producing almost the least amount of peer-reviewed Antarctic-related material. So it really makes you wonder if they're so committed to Antarctic science and they're building bases and runways and they're determined to increase their presence, and they say it's in the name of scientific inquiry, why is so little scholarship being produced? What are they doing in these bases if they're not doing the type of science that lends itself to peer-reviewed publication? So that's how the United States and New Zealand and Australia and the United Kingdom, even the Russians to some extent, that's how our scientific communities judge the success of our Antarctic programs, based on what sort of new discoveries and new collaboration we can produce. The Chinese are not really a part of that game. So it leaves a lot of questions. And so far, we haven't seen a significant amount of bullying or coercion on the Antarctic continent. What I'm concerned about over the long term is that countries like New Zealand and Australia, who've already seen China play a very aggressive and coercive diplomatic and economic game with them over other issues, could apply that same set of tactics to Antarctica. And that's where I think we've got to be really attuned to how are the Chinese interacting with our partners. And if we don't get this squared away, if we don't start making the investments to be our own, we've got to take care of ourselves. We've got to be capable of providing for the resupply of our bases. We've got to be capable of doing our own inspections. We've got to be able to be self-sufficient on the continent. We're going to get into a position where a lot of our partners and allies are very vulnerable to Chinese coercion, and we've got to be mindful of that.
Well, I can kind of see a world where 10 years from now, China is offering to supply all of the other countries' bases with food and other resources, gas for generators, and then everyone's dependent on China to support the bases. America's lost the capability to do the resupply. And then what can we do to stop China from militarizing?
Look, and anti-access doesn't just mean they're going to build a bunch of anti-ship missiles and keep everyone away, keep icebreakers away. It's not that. It doesn't have to be that dramatic. Anti-access could mean, because they have been the ones who are focused on building infrastructure in the Antarctic, and if we allow our capabilities to continue to atrophy, it could be that the Chinese are the ones who have the equipment on site to do a lot of the work that's required to keep bases running. There's very specialized equipment, whether it's snowmobiles, whether it's some of the heating supplies that are needed to keep these bases functioning. It may be that the Chinese have just cornered the market on some of the capabilities you have to have in Antarctica to stay long term and to be successful. And it may be that we know how this works from a defense industrial base standpoint. The United States doesn't really have a domestic icebreaker industrial base the way we used to. We're trying to get one back. Some companies are working on it. The government's supportive for the most part. But the Chinese are making huge investments in an icebreaker industrial base that'll let them continue to build those ships and to keep supplying their bases on the continent. So this can manifest itself in a number of ways. And you can imagine scenarios where the Chinese, essentially, whether it's de jure or de facto, the Chinese are in control of who and what can come onto the continent, and you have to enter into some sort of bargain with them to make sure, to get the access that the treaty ostensibly allows to everyone. And that's the scenario that I very much want to see us avoid if we can start now doing the difficult things necessary to prevent it from happening.
Are you saying the U.S. can't build icebreakers right now?
I'm saying that the U.S. It's been quite a while since we built one. We could have a longer conversation about American shipbuilding, but the United States is not building very specialized ships. The United States has some issues with building a number of specialized ships like this, and there are very few shipyards as the number of U.S. shipyards in general continues to shrink. There are very few yards that can do this work, and the ones that can, it'll take them quite a while to do it. So in the Trump administration, the decision was made to proceed with leasing icebreakers from Finland because that was going to be a faster route to getting icebreakers in service than going through the process of building them domestically. It's a real problem. I mean, there are a lot of key capabilities in competition with China that we allowed to atrophy. And as you guys know, a lot of those capabilities are things that through unfair trade practices or through controlling different parts of the supply chain, the Chinese were very much involved in allowing us to get to the point where we didn't have those capabilities. So icebreakers is just another example of where we've got to take a hard look at our industrial base if we want to remain competitive.
Is the Biden administration carrying on the leasing from Finland for icebreakers, or is that?
I have not seen any public change to that. I hope it continues, and I hope at the same time, we're going to make some investments, government investments in an icebreaker capability. There are things like building icebreakers, like having certain manufacturing capabilities that really, if the market has failed and the market can't sustain that capability, the government's going to have to step in for national security reasons and make sure that we have that domestic capability. We can't be reliant on, I think the leasing deal was fantastic, and I was very involved in it in the administration. But we can't be reliant on a foreign power to provide us with something as simple as an icebreaker that we need to ensure that we have access in both the North and the South Poles. And so we've got to make some national investments in things like shipbuilding, so we're not stuck in a position like this.
Well, I want to take a quick diversion that's not really a diversion to dig into this a bit, because you kind of hinted that the atrophying shipbuilding capability and the loss of shipyards in the U.S. was possibly tied to China?
Yeah, I mean, this is a larger issue with the U.S. maritime industry. So the U.S. maritime industry started off after World War II. We were the predominant merchant fleet in the world. And we've long had capability, we've long had legislation to try and protect the domestic shipbuilding industry from unfair foreign competition. Unfortunately, what has happened starting in the 80s and then moving on to the present day is first Japan, then South Korea, and now China massively subsidize their state-backed shipbuilding enterprises. And they provide certainly not a level playing field, and they provide the type of economic and financial support to national champion shipbuilders that the United States stopped doing during the Reagan administration. And so we have these kind of they're not exactly, so we have the Jones Act, for instance. So these are not direct subsidies. They're not direct payments to the shipbuilding industry. They're kind of informal ways of ensuring that we have a domestic industry. Jones Act is great. It's critical. Unfortunately, since we don't domestically and directly subsidize our shipbuilding industry, what happens is the Chinese come in at a much lower cost, and they take most of the world's international maritime trade. And that just continues to put the U.S. industry farther and farther in a hole. And if you look at a graph of where the number of ships under U.S. flag and the number of ships built in the United States over the last 40 years, it declines year over year over year. And that's not just an economic problem, that's a national security problem. And it manifests itself not just in the merchant marine, but in things like icebreakers, specialized capabilities that require a really diverse and vital shipbuilding and ship repair industrial base. And unfortunately, this has real national and strategic security implications.
Wow. So when ships aren't being built in the U.S., you're saying what's happening is, like, if China's building the ships, then the ships also end up staying owned by China and flying the Chinese flag. Like, it's not like American companies are then buying those Chinese ships and now they're American ships, right?
Yeah. So what I'm saying is the Chinese state-owned shipbuilding enterprises are going and they're building ships massively subsidized. They're either flying the Chinese flag and they have a significant merchant marine, or they're being the Chinese-built ships are flying Panamanian or Liberian or Maltese flags. And so either way you cut it, you end up with a significant Chinese, shipbuilding presence around the world. And so that's the concern that I really have is, they're, through a variety of domestic policies, they've been able to gain a significant advantage in that market. And unfortunately, we don't. We have, through a variety of domestic policy decisions in the United States, we've gone in the other direction. And ultimately, what's happened is there are national security implications of those decisions. And one of them is, in key areas, it could be icebreakers, it could be certain types of merchant and cargo ships, it could be things like oilers and tankers. We have begun to atrophy in our ability to compete globally in those fields, and it's a national security threat.
Essentially, it gives China the power to control access to the seas.
Well, it's part of a larger. If you look at how the Chinese view Alfred Thayer Mahan, the naval theorist. And you look at the writings of senior PLAN admirals, and you look at science of strategy and different things that are I think, credible academic and practical writings in China. They very much view trade as following the flag, the way that 19th century European and American naval scholars viewed it. And there's very much a holistic approach to having a global navy, having a global merchant marine, having bases around the world to sustain both trade and a naval presence. And in some ways, what you're seeing with the Chinese industrial policy, naval policy, their approach to the merchant marine, their approach to overseas basing, their approach to expansion in places like Antarctica, the Arctic, the deep sea. You look at this holistically, this is almost like you're looking at how Western Europeans and the United States were approaching the world in the late 19th century. It's really, to me, it's really kind of a fascinating back to the future sort of approach. And we've got to get our heads around the fact that the Chinese are thinking of they're looking at the world from a perspective that we no longer have. That to them, industrial policy is not a dirty word. They speak, as you guys know well, they speak about these things in terms of spheres of influence and in terms of control of resources. And it's a very kind of pseudo-Bismarckian approach to the world. And we've got to understand that when we're making national level policy decisions.
Well, it seems like over the years, the U.S. has become aware of this kind of thinking in the Chinese Communist Party in the South China Sea or even the Arctic. Why is that not being recognized in Antarctica?
Well, I said this earlier. I think Antarctica, because it's far away.
But the Arctic is far away, too, in a sense. I mean, I guess technically the U.S.
Alaska
borders it. Yeah. So is that the difference between the Arctic and Antarctica?
I think it's two things. One, because of the way the sea ice has melted in Antarctica, in the Arctic, it has generated more publicity for what's going on in the far north. And if you look at the latest IPCC report, it talks about the melting of sea ice in the Arctic versus the Antarctic. And the Antarctic is much less likely to see those massive changes to its pack ice the way it is in the Arctic. So I think that's, in terms of getting public attention, that's a big part of it. If you look at the Arctic, because Russia is probably the predominant challenger to American supremacy in the Arctic, I think that's also another reason why a lot of attention has been focused on the far north. It's multipolarity. It's multiple strategic competitors focused on the same area. And the other thing is the Arctic borders Alaska, and you've got 2 U.S. senators and a congressman who are very focused on it and who are able to raise attention in Washington to the challenge in the Arctic. Remember, the icebreakers are primarily, from a U.S. policy standpoint, the icebreakers are primarily focused on the Arctic. The Antarctic is just kind of an ancillary benefit of this. So, I think for U.S. domestic political reasons, for geopolitical reasons related to Russia, for climate change reasons, I think you end up in a position where the Arctic is just something that gets a lot more attention, and Antarctica, kind of gets short shrift.
See, I have an idea. What we should do is America should take over the Falkland Islands. That'll work out really well. And then we make it a state. And then we have senators and a congressman. And now America is a near Antarctic state.
Or the South Island of New Zealand.
Matt, that's totally stupid. This is a serious conversation. Clearly what I'm getting from you is we need to double down on global warming so Antarctica starts to melt as well, and then China can't have a base there.
Sure, why don't we just buy Greenland? So I heard someone propose that. That was an idea.
Someone very popular and well-loved.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about if you think about the Arctic versus the Antarctic, the challenge in the Arctic is it's a more immediate challenge. We can visualize the Russian submarine going to the bottom of the Arctic Sea and planting the Russian flag, right? That's something that Americans and policymakers can really internalize. The Arctic's a little more inchoate. The Antarctic, it's we know that the Chinese are there. We know there are 5 bases. We know that there's some stuff going on that raises some red flags and some concerns, but it's much harder to get traction and to light a fire under people in Washington, no pun intended, just because it doesn't exactly strike us as a day-to-day challenge. But my point to you is, I think that if we don't act now, it is going to be a front burner day-to-day challenge. And that's why we have to make the investments today, so we don't end up like the South China Sea 5 years from now.
I mean, I think, is there some kind of complacency too in the Antarctic? Because, like you said, we avoided any kind of militarization during the Cold War. Is there a sense that like, oh, well, that's over, like now it's just scientific and everybody's abiding by these treaties?
Well, you have that. I think the treaty breeds complacency because there was no treaty in the Arctic. In the Antarctic, you've had a treaty since the 50s that says you can't militarize, you can't do economic activity. It largely worked. It's often, if you go to these international law conferences, people hold it up as the great example of multilateralism and global commons and how we can come up with these international regimes that actually succeed. Because of that sense of kind of patting ourselves on the back, we really have just kind of put it out of sight, out of mind. And this is like, to me, this is like space. This is like cyberspace. This is like the Caribbean. This is like South Atlantic. This is like the Pacific Islands. This is like the deep seabed. So many places where the Chinese see kind of a vacuum. They see the West without having kind of let their guard down, and they move into the seams in between these areas of focus. And next thing you know, you have a crisis on your hands because we have become complacent and we have taken our advantages for granted.
China is definitely going to be doing the same playbook on Mars. I swear it will be the same thing.
So is America doing like drone flybys, like the kind of drones we use in the Middle East?
Can you do drones in Antarctica?
The Chinese research stations?
I'll tell you one thing that I learned from my time in government. There is almost nothing harder in the United States government than getting an unmanned aerial vehicle to do anything.
That's more difficult than getting Congress to do something?
But I thought Obama like sent tons of drones across the Middle East.
So that's my point, that there are limited assets, and everyone in Washington, from the president on down, wants to use the limited assets for whatever they think the most important thing is. And look at Afghanistan. You're going to have most of our UAS capability probably focused on Afghanistan for the foreseeable future. The limited capability that's focused, unfortunately limited, should be more, that's focused on the Indo-Pacific, focuses on things that you can guess. Theaters like Antarctica or even the Arctic or the South Atlantic or the Caribbean have to fight tooth and nail for capabilities. And then Antarctica has the unique, I mentioned a little bit about the State Department and how at the State Department, it gets thrown into the scientific bureau instead of being something that's focused on by the regional bureaus who have all the clout. You look organizationally, the way that the US government expresses its interest in something is often based on how the bureaucracy is organized to address that issue. And so at the National Security Council, for instance, where I worked, the Antarctic ended up being largely handled by a brilliant Coast Guard officer, but he was put in the same bureau, the same directorate as the directorate that was doing border control and handling all sorts of totally issues where Antarctica and the Arctic didn't really fit in. So there's an organizational challenge. The Pentagon's another example. Combatant commands, COCOMs. The COCOMs are not really set up to cover Antarctica. does it really fit in the Pacific Command, or does it fit in AFRICOM, or does it fit in Southcom? It's not really clear. So when you're talking about allocating assets to deal with something like China and Antarctica, you organizationally, we're not really set up to have a lot of success there at the moment.
It's interesting you say it that way because, when Trump created the Space Force, I mean, people laughed at that because it sounds silly. But in a way, he was doing is saying, organizationally, we need to handle space and certain space cyber stuff at a higher organizational level so it doesn't get buried down underneath the Air Force, right?
Yeah, it's all a statement of all that stuff. It's all a statement of the president's focus, his priorities, his values. And that's what, when people roll their eyes at how is the bureaucracy organized, it's really just a statement of what does our leadership care about. And the Space Force is a great example of that. When we were at the National Security Council, we reorganized some of the directorates so that there was a China focus in other regional directorates. So there would be a director who was thinking about China in Europe, China in Latin America, China in different parts of the world. So these are all different ways that the government can express what it cares about, and it matters.
So I think I was right about the Ice Force.
Yeah.
Biden, I've got a great suggestion for you.
Let me play devil's advocate. I think it's clear the U.S. government does see China as a strategic competitor. But as you've said, Antarctica is far away. It's resource intensive to go there. Does it make more sense to challenge the Chinese Communist Party in regional theaters that are easier to get to, like in the Indo-Pacific? Focus the energy and limited resources there instead of worrying about something that's difficult like Antarctica?
So it's an important question, and it gets to the larger strategic point of, one, what is worth expending effort on? Are there theaters that we should just cede to the Chinese? I know that there's a lot of discussion now about, the Chinese are going to suck us into just endless quagmires, and we're going to end up having to contest them in all these different theaters. Everywhere there's an OBOR project, we're going to get sucked into having some, fruitless counter OBOR effort. My sense is that's a bit of I think that's a bit of an exaggeration of what's required to be successful. Obviously prioritization is key. You can't be everywhere at once. We have to focus on the theaters that are most determinative for the long-term competition. So certainly the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea. This is all, I think we all probably are in agreement on where are the most essential places. But the amount of resources that are required by the United States to compete with China, or at least to not allow them free rein, is relatively minimal. So my argument is the U.S. remains, by most metrics, I would say, all if not most metrics, the predominant power in the world, economically, militarily, culturally, diplomatically. We have the ability, if we have the will, we have the underlying capability to do simple things like build icebreakers, like provide for C-130s that can land on the ice, like make sure that we're doing the type of alliance and partnership management so that we're burden sharing with the Aussies and the Kiwis, so they're helping us do inspections of bases in Antarctica, and we're upholding one of the most important and successful international treaty regimes of the last 50, 60 years. These are kind of blocking and tackling basic global management skills that we have no reason to just concede. So I take your point that we have to be prioritizing things like, in my view, prioritizing the balance in the Taiwan Strait, making sure that the South China Sea, we're managing that situation as best we can. But I would also argue that something like Antarctica is a bit of canary in the coal mine for how we're going to handle competition more broadly. And it doesn't take some sort of national mobilization to make sure that we can build some icebreakers, we can do inspections per our treaty commitments, and we can help our partners, keep our bases supplied. That's all kind of, to me, that's just basic good governance, superpower responsibility 101.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Alex. For anyone watching who would like to know more about China's role in Antarctica, where should they go, or where can they see more from your writings?
Yeah, so I've written about this in the national interest. I'm working on a larger piece on the topic. I would also encourage anyone who's really interested in this to read Professor Anne-Marie Brady's amazing book, China as a Polar Power, which covers both the North Pole and the South Pole. And she's written some larger scholarly journal articles on it as well. So I think there's a lot of material out there. And one of the things Anne-Marie does is she actually reads Chinese language source material, translates it, and gives the reader a sense of how the Chinese are talking about Antarctica, which has really informed my view of the challenge to look at their own words on the topic.
I wish we would look at their own words more often. Thank you very much, Alex. Take care. This was great talking to you about this.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Wow. So what I'm taking from this is U.S.-China policy and me at parties has a lot in common.
What do you mean, Chris?
Trouble breaking the ice.
Oh. How long did it take you to come up with that one?
Oh, I've been sitting on it the entire podcast.
Okay. Amazing it hasn't melted.
What?
You're breaking the ice joke.
That was pretty good.
It was a hit. I was also, desperately trying to hold back all the pop culture references.
Including Evangelion.
There's
which by the way is like 30 years old, so it's not really a pop culture reference.
The new movie just came out.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Just came out on Amazon. It's fresh.
Sure. Okay.
Also, the second Stargate is in Antarctica. Stephen King's It, all the Lovecraftian horrors that exist in Antarctica, the Mountains of Madness. A lot happens in Antarctica.
I mean, it's a huge place, and I don't know exactly how many square miles, but it's giant, and not just on a map where it looks super big, but if you look at a globe, you can see it's very substantial.
You could fit in the entire New York City inside of Antarctica.
You could fit so many New York states. It's unbelievable. Just think the amount of time it takes to fly across the United States, the continental United States. It's probably not that different for Antarctica. That's how much space is in between stuff.
Are you sure Antarctica's not bigger?
It might be. It's also, technically it's also an archipelago.
Oh, true.
If you remove the ice,
ice,
it's a bunch of islands. But there's big land masses too. And some of the land masses are buried under a kilometer of ice. So that's
what's underneath the ice?
Obviously Lovecraftian horrors.
There you go.
Okay.
What's the matter, Shelley?
Nothing. Are we going to actually talk about Antarctica, or are we just going to...
Oh, we are talking. We've been talking about it this whole time,
Okay.
Shelley.
Thank you. What happens if China gets to that second Stargate?
Is that more dangerous than the Russians having it?
Yeah, probably. Because then they'll just colonize other worlds. They will be the Goa'uld.
I'm looking forward to seeing the Chinese reboot of Stargate.
Well, they will liberate it'll be the same thing. They're liberating all these worlds from Goa'uld feudalism.
What I think, right now it's very hard to get to Antarctica. And so I can understand the lack of resources going towards it. But we've seen how over the last, 50 years, it's gotten easier and easier to get everywhere, right? The amount of time it takes to get from New York to Tokyo.
Well, there are some very specific differences to Antarctica.
No. I get that. But it would have been much harder for China, for example, to militarize Fiery Cross Reef in the South China Sea 50 years ago compared to the amount of technology, the amount of shipping, the amount of just sheer stuff you could put on a boat, the drilling and building technology. All of this has improved so much that it makes every part of the globe more accessible. And so I can imagine that 5 decades from now, should technology continue to progress at the insane rate it has been, it'll be easy to do stuff anywhere. And, once China has established its claims, as they're trying to do now, and with the whole Madrid Treaty expires at the end of 2048 or whatever, by the time that happens, the technology will already be in a place where China can do an unbelievable amount of stuff. And then there's going to be just not much we can do about it because it'll, planted their flag, so to speak.
I mean, because I just worked on that episode we did on China Uncensored about China building a village villages in Bhutan. What it really reminded me of is the fact that China first sent Tibetan yak herders to Bhutan to claim territory in the 90s. And they didn't have the capability to build anything there yet. So literally there were just like these 4 Tibetan yak herders that they made stay in this area year round, just so they could kind of keep a claim on this land. And kind of they had more herders around. They made them paint words like China on the rocks. As this is the level of the territorial claim going on. It's like literally we're going to paint the Chinese flag on rocks. And then what happened was that then they, when they were able to, they started building roads. They didn't build that village until 2015.
So they laid the groundwork pretty early.
Yeah. So
like 20 years after they started. So right now we have 5, we'll call them research facilities in Antarctica, as Alex says, right? And they've got a runway, and who knows, like the kind of infrastructure they can lay down.
I totally think that China could try to settle Antarctica.
I mean, they can definitely force their population to move lots of places.
Well, I mean, look at what they did in the South China Sea, right? With their Sansha city that's in Woody Island. And
visit the wonderful vacation resort of Antarctica.
No, they could do it.
There are Antarctica tours that people pay $10,000, even upwards of $70,000, $80,000 to go on.
Yeah, I mean, those right now are like essentially luxury cruises, and you can kind of go on land, but you can't stay there really.
I saw one that was only 75,000 pounds per person, and you fly on private jet to a couple different parts of Antarctica, and there's a place to stay.
But it's not like a hotel, right? It's like
it is like a hotel.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
you can stay
You can stay in Antarctica near the South Pole.
Interesting. And, okay, that's much more expensive.
Yeah, like I saw their videos, like a private jet and stuff, and I was like, wow, that's really cool. I mean, I don't have 75,000 pounds.
That's a lot.
Spend. It's a lot of money. But again, like everything's going to get cheaper. The technology's going to make everything easier. I can imagine, like, Chinese built a Chinese airline can go from, Shanghai to, Antarctica. It's a doable flight if you can refuel there.
Yeah, I mean, look at the South China Sea. They started building runways and facilities, and they were like, oh, well, it's just for civilian use. Maybe in Antarctica, they'll be like, everything's for scientific use. And then
they'll call them scientific tours. And
and then you need people there, right, to kind of supply the scientific tours.
So cities,
to stay there year round. You'll need an economy there.
And you need some sort of policing unit to protect the civilians who are there, providing the commercial stuff,
and eventually missile launchers to protect all of this stuff from aggressive foreign powers.
Yeah,
but really, this is exactly what China will be doing in space with their supposed moon base on the dark side of the moon that they want to build.
Can't wait for the Chinese moon tour.
Oh yeah, Mars too. Mars is going to be. Supposedly, like the Antarctic Treaty will be sort of the basis for how the international community handles Mars, but we see how it's going in China.
Scientific cooperation.
I feel like the fundamental problem here is thinking that a treaty will stop the Chinese Communist Party from doing something.
I like how they were just like, yeah, it's done in 2048.
Yeah.
But it's not done.
Well, it's like when they said, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, it has no meaning.
Well, they said it expired after the handover, essentially. But they only said that like a couple of years ago.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so, it's
a
just
historical
whatever.
document.
Yeah.
This treaty is a historical document. It was signed way back in 1950.
Historical documents, Shelley, are totally irrelevant unless they're maps that show that China had a territory since ancient times.
Right.
You have to respect those. You have to respect those historical documents, Shelley.
Yeah, exactly.
But the idea of, I think it's interesting, how do you stop the Chinese Communist Party? Yeah, they obviously want the U.S. and other countries to be distracted, trying to like do little stopgap measures all over the world. When like really, like if you just cut off the money supply to the Chinese Communist Party, that basically solves everything right now. Easy.
Yeah.
If BlackRock weren't suggesting we triple investments in China.
Oh,
Yeah.
so awful.
But see, China has $1 trillion. So I think I saw some kind of crazy number in Bloomberg about how big China's mutual fund market could be. Like $45 trillion or
It's
something
big
like
enough
that.
to fit inside Antarctica.
So, BlackRock wants a piece of that.
Oh yeah, it's in the interest of its investors.
Yeah, I mean, I think American corporate greed probably has a big part to play in Antarctica as well. Like, for example, if, like Alex talked about shipbuilding, right? Like, it's cheaper for U.S. companies like Walmart and whatever to get stuff from China, and they don't care that all of those ships that are coming into the San Francisco Bay or New Jersey are Chinese-made and Chinese-owned ships.
Well, it's a little more than that because, like, why is it cheaper to ship from the other side of the world?
'Cause
Well,
it's being subsidized.
Yeah, there was this article about how it's cheaper to catch salmon in the United States, ship it to China for processing, and then ship the salmon back to the U.S.
mhm.
That's
insane.
That's insane. But I also think that means there's probably some kind of screwed up policies in the U.S. that help make it that way.
Well, I mean, I think one problem is that there's no penalty for doing that, right? I mean, I get there's tariffs now, which is a start, right? But like, yeah, you can just do anything if you can find it a little bit cheaper, even if like the reason it's cheaper is because of, a foreign power messing with the rules.
Well, I'm saying I'm not sure it is entirely just that, like, China subsidizes things. There's probably also, restrictions in the U.S. that just make it cheaper to export abroad.
Yeah. Well, the world is complex, and the solution is China Uncensored trip to Antarctica.
Mm-hmm.
We'll probably catch some frozen bacterial disease and bring it back with us.
Yeah, that's not funny anymore.
Or was it a joke? Antarctica's a freaky place.
It is a freaky place. I think it's a cool place. I think it's a really interesting place. And I'd love to, do a flyover of some of those Chinese bases.
I wonder if you could actually fly over the Chinese bases.
Without them shooting you down?
Well, hopefully they don't have anything installed that can actually shoot planes down.
But we don't know because we're not doing it. We're not going over there, right?
That's
We're not
true,
sending, unmanned aerial vehicles over, then we don't know. Satellites can only tell you so much.
Well, I wonder if how drones can even operate in that kind of weather.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
Maybe we can get some more advanced drones. Maybe China will build them for us, and then we can just rent them.
That's not a joke. Remember, what was that thing where was it Colorado that was trying to get Chinese DJI drones to help in policing or something?
I don't think it was Colorado, but during the pandemic, some city used these drones to announce to people that they weren't supposed to be out without masks or something. And I think they were using DJI drones.
I mean, what's crazy about that is I actually saw footage of the Chinese authorities using drones to intimidate people during COVID.
Yeah, I think we include that in an episode.
But we didn't only the city didn't only take the Chinese drones. They took that entire authoritarian model of using drones in the skies to instill fear in the populace.
Well, Hey, China has no COVID cases.
Oh, that's right. That's the new thing. No COVID in China. Well, they solved that. If I think that they've gotten it right.
They did. I saw this nice video of them spraying disinfectant in giant clouds everywhere. And that's all it takes.
All right.
It's gone.
I think we should believe China on everything it says, not just on COVID, but also that they're only doing scientific research in Antarctica.
Well, I mean, look at the treaty. It's worked so well.
Until 2048 when it expires.
Technically 2049, I think is what he was saying.
So now that you've said that, Shelley, on the podcast, they're going to use this as evidence.
According to American experts.
I don't think they're going to use this.
Probably not. Anyways, thank you for watching this episode of China Unscripted. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
We'll see you next time.